Imagine you are reading a book written 2,300 years ago by one of the greatest minds in human history, and buried inside it, almost as an aside, is a description of a civilization so large, so detailed, so specific in its measurements and its metals and its military numbers, that you find yourself doing something strange. You find yourself wondering whether it was real. The writer is Plato. The civilization is Atlantis. And the description he gives, the concentric rings of water and stone, the palace walls sheathed in a metal that glowed like fire, the army of 1,000,000 soldiers, the empire that reached across the ancient world before vanishing beneath the sea in a single catastrophic night, is either the most elaborate philosophical fiction ever written, or the oldest historical mystery still unsolved. For over 2 millennia, the world has been trying to decide which one. Tonight, we are going to follow that question all the way back to its source, to a philosopher in Athens, to a traveler in Egypt, to the ruins of a civilization that was swallowed by a volcano, to the seafloor off the coast of Spain, to a landmass beneath the North Sea that was once home to thousands of people who watched their world disappear beneath the rising water and never stopped talking about it. We may not find Atlantis at the end of this journey. No one ever has. But we are going to find something stranger, and in some ways, more remarkable. The long, restless 2,000-year story of what it means to search for something you are not sure ever existed, and why, no matter how many times the search comes up empty, human beings simply cannot stop. This is the search for the lost island of Atlantis. There is a moment in the middle of an ordinary afternoon in the 4th century, before the Common Era, when a philosopher picks up a stylus and begins to write about a place that, as far as we can tell, no one had ever written about before. His name is Plato. He is in his 60s, one of the most celebrated thinkers in the ancient world, a man whose ideas about justice, beauty, and the nature of reality have already begun reshaping how educated people understand their existence. He has written dialogues that will be read for the next 2,500 years without interruption. He has founded an institution, the Academy, that will become the prototype for every university ever built. And yet, on this particular afternoon, sitting somewhere in Athens with the sounds of the city drifting through open stone walls, he begins to write something that does not quite fit with the rest of his work. He begins to write about an island empire, so large it dwarfed any civilization he had ever known. He writes about gleaming cities built in perfect concentric rings. He writes about a palace at the center, surrounded by walls sheathed in a mysterious red metal that caught the light of the sun and blazed like fire. He writes about an empire that sent 100,000 soldiers and 1,200 warships against the ancient world. And then he writes about how that empire, in a single terrible night and day, sank beneath the waves of the Atlantic Ocean and vanished without a trace. The name of that island was Atlantis. And from that moment, from that afternoon when a philosopher pressed a bronze stylus into a wax tablet, one of the most persistent mysteries in all of human history was born. Not just a question about whether a place existed, but a question about what we owe to the past, what memory can and cannot preserve, and how far back the roots of civilization actually reach. The story of Atlantis is, at its heart, a story about the relationship between human memory and the deep, indifferent ocean of time. For over 2,300 years, the world has been arguing about what Plato meant and whether any of it was true. Scholars have mapped it onto the Atlantic Ocean, the Mediterranean Sea, the Caribbean, the North Sea, the coast of Spain, and even the frozen plains of Antarctica. Archaeologists have dived beneath the waves looking for its ruins. Geologists have measured sediment cores and seafloor formations, trying to find evidence of a sudden, catastrophic submersion. Philosophers have read and reread Plato's words in the original Greek, searching for clues embedded in the grammar itself. Mystics have claimed to receive its location through psychic visions, and novelists, filmmakers, and dreamers have rebuilt it entirely in the imagination, filling in all the details that Plato left blank. None of them have found it, and yet none of them have stopped looking. That persistence, that extraordinary durability of a search that has never once produced a confirmed discovery, tells us something profound about the nature of the human mind. We are, as a species, incapable of accepting that an answer simply does not exist. We are compelled to look. We are drawn toward mystery, the way water is drawn downhill, following every channel and crack until it finds somewhere to gather. And Atlantis, more than almost any other mystery in recorded history, has gathered to itself a staggering amount of human longing. So let us begin at the beginning. Let us begin with Plato, in Athens, in the years around 360 before the Common Era, and understand who this man was before we can understand why the world believed him. Athens in the 4th century, before the Common Era, was a city still trying to understand what it had survived. A century earlier, it had stood at the center of Greek civilization's greatest moment, the period when philosophy, drama, mathematics, and democracy had all flowered simultaneously in a way that would not be equaled for 1,000 years. The city had watched the Persian Wars, the long ships burning at Salamis, the hoplites fighting at Marathon. It had seen the construction of the Parthenon, gleaming on the Acropolis above the city's noisy streets. It had been the home of Socrates, who walked barefoot through the agora, asking people questions they did not want to answer, and who was eventually executed for doing so. Plato was born into this world in approximately 428 before the Common Era, a few years after the beginning of the great and devastating Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta that would eventually break Athenian power. His family was aristocratic, well-connected, and deeply embedded in the political life of the city. By birth and expectation, Plato was positioned to enter public life, to take his place among the powerful men who steered Athenian policy. But something happened that redirected the entire course of his life, and that event was his encounter with Socrates. He became a devoted student of Socrates as a young man, and when the Athenian democracy executed Socrates in 399 BCE on charges of impiety and corrupting the youth, Plato was devastated. He was around 28 years old, and the judicial murder of his teacher convinced him that direct political engagement was dangerous and probably futile. He turned instead toward philosophy, toward education, toward the long and patient work of shaping minds rather than steering governments. He traveled to Sicily, to Egypt, possibly to other parts of the Mediterranean world, absorbing ideas and gathering experiences that would take decades to fully process. And around 387 BCE, back in Athens, he founded the academy on a piece of land in the city's outskirts, named after the legendary hero Academos. It was a place for sustained intellectual inquiry, and it would operate continuously for nearly 900 years. For the next several decades, Plato wrote. He wrote in a distinctive literary form, the dialogue, in which ideas were dramatized through conversations between named characters, usually with Socrates playing a central role, even in works written long after his death. Through these dialogues, Plato worked through some of the most enduring questions in philosophy. What is justice? What is the ideal form of government? What is the relationship between the physical world we can see and touch, and the abstract world of mathematical and moral truths that seem to transcend the physical? His most famous work, The Republic, proposed a utopian city-state governed by philosopher kings. His symposium explored the nature of love through a series of interlocking speeches at a dinner party. His Phaedo explored the immortality of the soul on the day of Socrates' death. These works established Plato as one of the foundational thinkers of Western civilization, and they did so precisely because they grappled with questions that remained permanently open and permanently urgent. But in the final years of his life, he lived until approximately 347 BCE, dying in his early 80s. Plato wrote something different. He wrote two dialogues, called Timaeus and Critias, which contained, almost as an aside, the story of Atlantis. These dialogues were connected to the themes of his wider work. They were concerned with the origins of the universe, with the nature of the physical world, with the relationship between ideal forms and historical reality. But embedded within them was this strange, vivid, impossibly detailed account of a civilization that existed before recorded history and was then erased by the sea. And the detail is what stops you, because Plato was not a careless writer. He was one of the most precise and deliberate prose stylists of antiquity. Every word in his dialogues is considered. Every character, every setting, every image is chosen. And yet in Timaeus and Critias, he presents the story of Atlantis not as obvious allegory, not as clearly labeled fiction, but as something passed down through a specific and traceable chain of historical transmission. He gives it a provenance. He gives it witnesses. He gives it geography. So precise, you could theoretically put a ruler to a map. The source, as Plato tells it, was a man named Solon. And to understand Solon, and to understand what he supposedly heard in Egypt, we need to travel back further still, another 200 years before Plato, to the early 6th century before the Common Era, to the city of Athens at a time when democracy itself had not yet been invented. Before we follow the chain of transmission backward in time, we should spend a moment with the actual description that Plato gives us, because it is one of the strangest documents in ancient literature, and understanding its strangeness is essential to understanding why the world has been arguing about it ever since. In the dialogue called Critias, Plato provides what can only be described as an architectural and geographic specification for Atlantis. It is not vague. It is not atmospheric. It reads, in places, less like mythology and more like the field notes of an ancient surveyor who had actually walked the streets of the city and counted its paving stones. The island itself, Plato tells us, was larger than Libya and Asia combined, which in ancient Greek geographic terms meant a landmass of extraordinary size, stretching across a significant portion of the Atlantic Ocean. It lay just beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which we know today as the Strait of Gibraltar, the narrow passage between the Mediterranean Sea and the open Atlantic. Beyond those pillars, in the wide, dark ocean that the ancient Greeks thought of as the edge of the known world, Atlantis stood. The civilization that inhabited it was descended, in the Platonic account, from the god Poseidon, who had fallen in love with a mortal woman named Plato and taken her as his consort. Their union had produced 5 sets of twin boys, and these 10 sons became the 10 kings who divided the island among themselves, with the eldest son, Atlas, ruling as the paramount king and giving the ocean, the Atlantic, its name. For many generations, these kings and their descendants governed Atlantis with wisdom and moderation, maintaining an empire that extended not only across the island itself, but across much of the known world, including large portions of Europe and Africa. They were powerful, they were wealthy, and for a long time, by the account Plato gives us, they were good. But then something changed. Plato describes a slow corruption, a gradual dilution of the divine blood that had made the original Atlantean kings so virtuous. As the human element in their nature grew stronger and the divine element grew weaker, they became greedy, grasping, obsessed with the accumulation of wealth and power at the expense of the deeper goods, wisdom, justice, temperance. And so the gods, led by Zeus, looked down and decided that this civilization needed to be punished. The text of the Critias breaks off here, tantalizingly incomplete. We do not get to read the full account of the punishment, though we know from the Timaeus what the outcome was. In a single day and night of extraordinary violence, earthquakes and floods consumed the island, and it sank beneath the sea. But what stays with you, what makes the description so persistently haunting, is the city itself. Plato describes the capital of Atlantis in a level of physical detail that is almost unparalleled in ancient literature, outside of actual historical accounts. The city was built around a low hill at the center of a fertile plain, and Poseidon himself had fortified this hill by surrounding it with alternating rings of land and water, 3 rings of water and 2 of land, creating a kind of natural concentric fortress. The outermost ring of water was 3 stades wide, a stade being the ancient Greek unit of measurement equivalent to roughly 185 meters, giving us a final ring approximately 550 meters across. The entire complex, with its rings of land and sea, measured about 27 kilometers from the outer edge of water to the central island. The central island itself, the innermost ring, contained the royal palace and the temple of Poseidon and Clito. The temple was encased in gold and silver, and a third material that Plato calls orichalcum, which glowed like fire and was second only to gold in value. We do not know for certain what orichalcum was. Ancient sources describe it inconsistently, sometimes as a natural alloy of copper and gold, sometimes as a fabricated metal of unusual properties. Some modern researchers have suggested it was simply a high-quality bronze, polished to a mirror finish. Others have proposed more exotic identifications. But the detail of its existence, the fact that Plato names it, describes its properties, mentions that the walls of the central shrine were coated in it, is the kind of specificity that does not typically appear in deliberately allegorical writing. The plain surrounding the city was enormous, 3,000 stades by 2,000 stades, which works out to roughly 550 by 370 kilometers. It was protected by mountains to the north and open toward the sea in the south. It was crossed by an elaborate system of canals and irrigation channels that the Atlanteans had built to drain and farm it systematically. There were hot and cold springs inside the city. There was a great harbor. There were racetracks for horses, barracks for soldiers, covered channels for ships to pass from the outer sea into the inner rings without being seen. The army that this empire could field was staggering in Plato's account. 10,000 war chariots, 60,000 cavalry, 1,200 warships, nearly 1 million soldiers of various kinds. These were the forces that had, according to the story, attacked and very nearly conquered both Athens and Egypt before being repelled by an Athenian army fighting alone, and then, shortly after, wiped from existence by the divine punishment. Read this description once, and it feels like myth. Too grand, too precise, too strange to be anything other than literary invention. Read it twice, and it starts to feel like something else. The specificity of the measurements, the naming of the metal, the careful accounting of military forces, the description of the canal system. These are not the rhetorical gestures of a man constructing an obvious parable. They are the gestures of a man who believes he is recording something real, or at least who wants his audience to believe that. And therein lies the central unresolved question. Was Plato a historian preserving a genuine tradition, a philosopher using historical seeming detail to make his moral argument more persuasive, or something more complex, a storyteller who had received fragments of real ancient history and expanded them imaginatively in ways he himself may not have fully distinguished from the original? That question has been alive for 2,300 years, and it remains alive today. To understand where Plato claimed he got his story, we need to travel back in time to approximately 590 before the Common Era and board a ship in the harbour at Athens, bound for Egypt. The man on that ship was Solon. And he was one of the most consequential figures in the early history of Athenian democracy. Born around 638 BCE into an aristocratic but not enormously wealthy family, Solon had risen to become the great lawgiver of Athens, the man who, more than any other single individual, had laid the legal and political foundations on which Athenian democracy would later be built. He had abolished debt slavery, which had been crushing the Athenian poor. He had reorganized the political classes on a basis of property rather than birth. He had created a council of 400 citizens to balance the power of the old aristocratic council of the Areopagus. He had written laws that were so important and so carefully balanced between competing interests that they were carved into wooden tablets and posted in the public spaces of Athens for everyone to read. But Solon was more than a lawgiver. He was also a poet and a traveller, a man of wide intellectual curiosity who understood that wisdom could be found in places other than Athens. Around 590 BCE, having passed his laws, and then deliberately left Athens for a decade so that no one could pressure him into changing them, he travelled widely across the Mediterranean world. And among his destinations was Egypt, the oldest continuous civilization in the ancient world, a place whose monuments and records stretched back 3,000 years by Solon's time, and whose priests were considered the custodians of an almost unimaginable depth of historical knowledge. Specifically, according to Plato, Solon travelled to the city of Sais in the Nile Delta. Sais was the cult centre of the goddess Neith, one of the oldest deities in the Egyptian pantheon, a goddess of wisdom and warfare whose worship stretched back to the earliest periods of Egyptian history. Her priests at Sais were renowned in the ancient world for their learning, and it was here, in the colonnaded precincts of the Temple of Neith, that something remarkable supposedly happened. Solon fell into conversation with the Egyptian priests. Being the naturally curious and intellectually engaged man he was, he began telling them stories of the earliest traditions of the Greeks, The flood myths, the genealogies of heroes, the great events of the distant past as the Greeks understood them. And one of the old priests, listening patiently to Solon's recounting of Greek history, gently deflated his visitor's pride with a response that must have stung. "Solon, Solon," the priest supposedly said, "you Greeks are always children. There is no old man among you." What he meant was that the Greeks had no deep historical memory. Their records reached back only a few generations before their traditions dissolved into mythology and confusion. The Egyptians, by contrast, had been keeping meticulous records for thousands of years. Their temple archives contained the history, not just of Egypt, but of events around the entire Mediterranean world, preserved in writing when other civilizations were still passing their histories down in song. And then the priest told Solon about Athens, not the Athens that Solon knew, the relatively young city of the classical period, but an ancient, primordial Athens that had existed 9,000 years before Solon's time, before the great floods that had periodically wiped out human civilization and erased all memory of earlier ages. This ancient Athens, the priest said, had been the greatest city in the world. Its warriors had been the finest and most virtuous fighters ever to take the field. And they had needed to be, because they had faced the greatest threat the ancient world had ever known. They had faced the empire of Atlantis. The priest described an island empire that had risen in the ocean beyond the Pillars of Hercules, a civilization of extraordinary wealth and military power that had built a vast domain and then turned its ambitions toward conquest. The Atlanteans had swept across the known world, subjugating the peoples of Europe and North Africa one by one, driving toward the heart of the Mediterranean. One by one, the other peoples had submitted or been crushed. Only Athens stood firm. Only the warriors of that ancient, now forgotten Athens had refused to yield. And in a final great battle, they had broken the Atlantean advance and liberated the peoples who had been enslaved. And then, shortly after this victory, the gods had intervened. The earth had shaken, the sea had risen, and in a single catastrophic night and day, both the great Athenian army and the island of Atlantis itself had been swallowed by the sea, leaving nothing behind but the memory preserved in Egyptian stone. This is the story that Solon brought back from Egypt, according to Plato's account. He carried it in his memory across the sea to Athens, intending eventually to write a great poem about it. Plato tells us that he even began to do so before other demands on his time intervened, and the project was never finished. Instead, the story passed from Solon to his relative Dropides, and from Dropides to his son Critias the elder, and from Critias the elder to his grandson Critias the younger, who was a real historical figure, an Athenian politician and intellectual who appears as a character in several of Plato's dialogues, and from Critias the younger, who had heard the story as a boy from his grandfather. It passed eventually to Plato. The transmission chain Plato offers is specific, traceable, and verifiable up to a point. Solon was a real person. Critias the younger was a real person. The Egyptian city of Sais was a real place, and its temple of Neith was a real institution with real priests. Plato is not making any of this up, or at least he's not making up the framework into which he places the story. Whether the story itself was real, whether the priests of Sais genuinely had records of an ancient civilization in the Atlantic, whether Solon genuinely heard what he claimed to hear, These are different questions entirely, but the framework is historically grounded in a way that gives the account a very different character from straightforward myth. This is one of the things that has kept serious scholars engaged with the Atlantis question for centuries. If Plato had simply invented the story wholesale as a pure literary creation, he would almost certainly not have gone to the trouble of constructing this elaborate and falsifiable provenance. He could have had one of his characters simply describe the legend as an ancient tradition, or have a god deliver it in a dream. The specific chain, the named individuals, the documented location, the institutional context of Egyptian priestly records suggests either that Plato was drawing on a genuine tradition, or that he was constructing a deliberate fiction with enough realistic scaffolding to make it persuasive. Both possibilities are disturbing in their own way. The ink was barely dry on Plato's dialogues before people began arguing about whether they were historically reliable. And the first and most important doubter was a man who had been Plato's student for 20 years and knew his methods as well as anyone alive. Aristotle had joined Plato's academy at the age of 17, around 367 BCE, and remained there until Plato's death in 347. He was the most brilliant student the academy ever produced, a mind of such extraordinary range and capacity that he would go on to write foundational texts in biology, physics, metaphysics, ethics, politics, rhetoric, poetics, and half a dozen other fields. He respected Plato enormously, while also disagreeing with him on fundamental questions. Most famously, on the question of whether abstract forms or ideas existed in some independent realm, separate from the physical world, as Plato maintained, or whether universal properties were inherent in physical objects themselves, as Aristotle argued. Aristotle's comment on Atlantis was brief but pointed. He reportedly said something to the effect that the man who invented Atlantis also made it disappear, meaning that Plato created the story and felt free to destroy it whenever the narrative required. The remark is preserved secondhand, but it captures something that Aristotle, with his intimate knowledge of Plato's methods, almost certainly believed that Atlantis was a literary and philosophical invention, a thought experiment dressed up in historical clothing, not a genuine historical tradition. This interpretation has had a very long and respectable life in scholarship. It argues, essentially, that Plato was doing what great writers often do, using the scaffolding of realistic detail to make an ethical argument feel urgent and concrete. The story of Atlantis in this reading is a moral fable about the dangers of imperial overreach and the corrupting effects of wealth and military power. The Atlanteans become corrupted by their success and are destroyed by divine justice. The Athenians, virtuous and humble, resist the temptation of empire and are vindicated. The message is timely. Plato was writing in the aftermath of an era when Athens itself had overreached catastrophically, pursuing an imperial policy that had led to its defeat in the Peloponnesian War. The Atlantis story in this reading is a mirror held up to Athens, warning it not to make the same mistake again. This is a powerful and sophisticated interpretation, and it has the advantage of not requiring the existence of any actual sunken continent. But it has always sat uneasily beside the level of physical detail Plato provides. If Atlantis was purely a philosophical parable, the elaborate specifications of canal dimensions and military rosters and architectural materials were unnecessary. Indeed, they were counterproductive, since they invited readers to take the story literally when a more obviously allegorical presentation would have conveyed the moral message more cleanly. Against Aristotle's skepticism, there stood the work of a philosopher named Crantor, who was one of the first scholars to study and comment on Plato's dialogues after his death. Crantor, writing in the late 4th century BCE, apparently accepted the historical basis of the Atlantis story and reportedly claimed to have sent messengers to Egypt who had confirmed with the priests of Sais that records of the kind Plato described did indeed exist. We do not have Crantor's original text and cannot fully evaluate this claim, but the fact that he made it suggests that the debate between believers and skeptics began almost immediately after Plato wrote down his account. As the centuries passed, the story of Atlantis moved through the ancient world in complicated ways. Roman writers engaged with it. The historian Diodorus Siculus described Atlantis in his 1st century BCE universal history, accepting it as a real place and elaborating on its description. The geographer Strabo was more skeptical, but acknowledged the story as widely known. The Neoplatonic philosophers of late antiquity, writers like Proclus in the 5th century CE, developed elaborate symbolic and spiritual interpretations of Atlantis as a representation of cosmic and metaphysical truths, embedding it firmly in the tradition of mystical interpretation that would resurface again and again in later centuries. The Christian Middle Ages largely ignored Atlantis or treated it as a curiosity, subsumed within the much more dominant flood narrative of Noah. The Islamic world translated Plato's works and preserved them, but Atlantis attracted little specific commentary. It was only with the Renaissance, with the recovery and widespread circulation of classical texts, that Atlantis began to attract serious new attention. And that attention accelerated dramatically when a series of events transformed the entire intellectual framework within which the story was understood. Those events were the European voyages of discovery, and most decisively, the arrival of Christopher Columbus in the Americas in 1492. When European explorers encountered the Americas in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, they were genuinely bewildered. Here was an entirely different half of the world, full of people and civilizations and natural wonders that no European tradition had prepared them for. Where had these people come from? How had they gotten there? And why were there? If you looked hard enough and squinted at the right angles, certain suggestive similarities between the cultures of Mesoamerica and those of the ancient Mediterranean and Near East. Pyramids here and pyramids there. Flood myths on both sides of the ocean. Sun worship, astronomical knowledge, complex calendrical systems. For many European thinkers, the easiest explanation was Atlantis. Here, suddenly, was a reason why the island might have existed. The Americas, or at least the connection between them and the Old World, could be explained by a now sunken landmass that had once formed a bridge across the Atlantic. Francis Bacon, the great English philosopher and scientist, wrote a work called New Atlantis in 1627, in which the survivors of the sunken Atlantis had supposedly colonized America and built a utopian scientific society there. Other writers proposed that Atlantis had been the homeland of the Native Americans, or that it had been a cultural bridge transmitting civilization from the Old World to the New. But the work that really brought Atlantis into the modern imagination, the book that transformed it from a classical curiosity into a full-scale popular obsession, was published in the United States in 1882 by a man named Ignatius Donnelly. Donnelly was one of the most fascinating figures of 19th century American intellectual life. Born in Philadelphia in 1831, he had been a lawyer, a congressman from Minnesota, a land developer, a reforming politician, and an enthusiastic amateur scholar with an insatiable appetite for big, transgressive ideas. He had run for vice president of the United States on the Populist Party ticket. He had written books arguing that Francis Bacon had written Shakespeare's plays, and that the world had been struck by a comet in ancient times, causing Noah's flood. He was not a professional academic, but he was brilliant, well-read, and possessed of a remarkable ability to synthesize information from across many different fields into a single compelling narrative. In 1882, after years of research, he published Atlantis, the antediluvian world. It was a sensation. It went through 50 editions in its first 20 years. It was read by prime ministers and presidents. It popularized the idea of Atlantis so thoroughly that virtually everything most people think they know about Atlantis today, the sunken continent, the advanced civilization, the connection to ancient cultures on both sides of the Atlantic, comes directly or indirectly from Donnelly's book. His argument was, for its time, audacious and synthetic. He gathered evidence from geology, mythology, linguistics, botany, and archaeology to argue that Atlantis had been a real place, located in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and that it had been the cradle of human civilization. All the ancient mythologies, the Greek, the Egyptian, the Aztec, the Norse, were, in Donnelly's view, distorted memories of the actual history of Atlantis. All the great ancient civilizations were colonies of Atlantis, or at least descendants of its survivors. The flood myths that appeared in cultures around the world were all memories of the same event, the submersion of Atlantis in a geological catastrophe. Donnelly pointed to the mid-Atlantic ridge, then recently discovered by oceanographic survey ships laying the first transatlantic telegraph cable, as physical evidence for a former landmass in the middle of the ocean. He pointed to the biological similarities between plants and animals on the two sides of the Atlantic, species that seemed too similar to have evolved independently, which he took as evidence that they had once been connected. He pointed to what he saw as architectural and cultural parallels between the ancient civilizations of Egypt and Mesoamerica as evidence of a common origin. What Donnelly got wrong was considerable, and modern scholarship has dismantled most of his specific arguments in detail. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge is a volcanic mountain range created by the spreading of tectonic plates, not the remnant of a sunken continent. The biological similarities he cited can be explained by continental drift, common ancestry from the time when the continents were joined, and independent evolution. The cultural parallels between Egypt and Mesoamerica, examined closely, are far less impressive than they appeared to a 19th century reader who was not deeply familiar with the specifics of either culture. Pyramids, for example, are a natural architectural solution to the problem of building very tall structures out of stone without the ability to engineer internal support systems. They appear independently in many cultures for practical reasons. But what Donnelly got right, or at least what he identified correctly as worth investigating, was the question of whether ancient cultures had been in contact with each other across the Atlantic Ocean before the era of recorded history. This question, the question of prehistoric transoceanic contact, remains genuinely open and is the subject of serious ongoing research. And he was right that Plato's account deserved to be taken seriously as a historical source, rather than simply dismissed as literary invention. Donnelly's book was a watershed. It established the framework within which most subsequent Atlantis research has operated, whether that research was rigorous or fanciful. And it did something more subtle and important. It moved Atlantis from the realm of classical scholarship into the realm of popular culture, where it took on a life that no amount of academic debunking has ever been able to fully contain. While Donnelly's Atlantic hypothesis was capturing the popular imagination in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, professional archaeologists were making discoveries that would eventually produce a very different and far more scientifically respectable candidate for Atlantis. And those discoveries began on the island of Crete, in the Aegean Sea, at the turn of the 20th century. In the spring of 1900, a British archaeologist named Arthur Evans began excavating a large mound of earth near the city of Heraklion on the northern coast of Crete. Evans had been drawn to Crete by small carved seal stones with strange, undeciphered inscriptions that had been turning up in the antiquities markets of Athens and Cairo. He suspected that these seals pointed toward a pre-Greek Bronze Age civilization on the island, possibly literate, possibly sophisticated, a civilization that had been entirely forgotten by the time the classical Greeks wrote their histories. And within weeks of beginning his excavation at the site, he called Knossos. He knew he had found something extraordinary. What emerged from the earth at Knossos over the next several years was the palace complex of what Evans would name the Minoan civilization, after the legendary king Minos of Crete from Greek mythology. The palace was enormous, covering an area of approximately 20,000 square meters, with over 1,000 rooms on multiple floors connected by a labyrinthine network of corridors, staircases, and light wells. It had frescoes on its walls showing young men and women leaping over the backs of charging bulls, the bull-leaping scenes that have become the most iconic images of Bronze Age Crete. It had sophisticated plumbing, with flush toilets and drainage systems that would not be seen again in Europe for 3,000 years. It had storerooms packed with enormous ceramic jars for olive oil and grain, evidence of a redistributive economy, managing resources on a large scale. It had workshops for potters and goldsmiths and ivory carvers, producing luxury goods of extraordinary refinement. And above all, it had writing. 2 different scripts, which Evans called Linear A and Linear B, representing one of the first literate civilizations in European history. The Minoans, as the picture assembled itself over decades of excavation across Crete, were a formidable maritime civilization. Their palaces, built without defensive walls in a period when other Bronze Age civilizations were obsessively fortified, suggested a people who felt secure behind the protection of their naval power. Their ships carried goods across the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean. Minoan pottery and metalwork has been found in Egypt, in Syria, in mainland Greece, in the islands of the Cyclades. They were traders, sailors and artists on a scale that no European civilization of their era could match. And then, sometime in the 2nd millennium, BCE, it all ended. The Minoan palaces were destroyed, not once, but in a series of waves. Knossos itself survived several destructions before it was finally abandoned. The other great palaces, Phaistos in the south, Malea on the northern coast, Zakros in the east, all met similar fates. By around 1450 BCE, the flourishing Minoan civilization was effectively over, replaced by a Mycenaean Greek culture that had been rising on the mainland and now extended its dominance across the Aegean. What had destroyed the Minoans? That question would become one of the most productive in the entire history of Atlantis research, because the answer, when it began to emerge in the mid-20th century, pointed toward an event of almost incomprehensible violence, an event that may have left a trail of memory all the way to Plato's writing desk. About 130 kilometers north of Crete, in the southern Aegean Sea, there is a group of islands that form a rough crescent around a large lagoon. The main island is called Santorini today, though its ancient name was Thera. It is one of the most dramatic landscapes in the entire Mediterranean world. Steep cliffs of dark volcanic rock, dropping hundreds of meters to a glittering blue sea. The cliff faces striped with layers of white and red and grey volcanic deposits. The caldera at the center so vast and so deep that large cruise ships anchor in it like toys in a bathtub. Santorini is dramatic because it is the remnant of a catastrophe. At some point in the second millennium, BCE, estimates have ranged widely, but center around 1600 to 1500 BCE, the island of Thera exploded, not metaphorically, not gradually. It exploded in one of the largest volcanic eruptions in human history, an event of such violence that it fundamentally altered the geography and ecology of the entire eastern Mediterranean, and may have been visible, in some form, from much of the ancient world. The Thera eruption has been estimated to have ejected somewhere between 30 and 60 cubic kilometers of material, rock, ash, pyroclastic flows, and gas, into the atmosphere. By comparison, the famous 1883 eruption of Krakatoa, which killed 36,000 people and sent ash around the world to lower global temperatures for a year, ejected approximately 21 cubic kilometers of material. Thera was substantially larger. Some estimates, using newer dating methods and sediment core analysis, suggest it may have been even larger than current mainstream estimates acknowledge. What the eruption would have produced, in sequence, is something like this. First, ash falls over a wide area, smothering crops and contaminating water supplies across hundreds of kilometers. The written records of ancient Egypt, papyri and official inscriptions from the period of the New Kingdom contain references to darkness, strange weather, and disrupted harvests that some researchers have connected to the Thera ash cloud. Then the collapse of the volcanic cone into the sea as the magma chamber emptied below it, generating tsunami waves of extraordinary height and speed radiating outward across the Aegean. These waves, striking the northern coast of Crete, would have been devastating, arriving with virtually no warning, penetrating far inland where the coastal plain was wide, destroying harbors and ships and the communities that depended on them. In the decades following the Thera eruption, the Minoan civilization collapsed. The palace at Akrotiri, on Thera itself, a large Minoan-influenced town that has been excavated over the past several decades in a remarkable state of preservation, its frescoes and pottery intact beneath meters of volcanic ash, often called the Pompeii of the Aegean, was already abandoned before the eruption, its inhabitants apparently having received some warning and departed. But the civilization on Crete and the broader network of trade and influence the Minoans had built did not survive the cumulative effects of the disaster. In 1939, the Greek archaeologist Spiridon Marinatos published a paper proposing that the Thera eruption was the cause of the Minoan collapse, and more significantly, that the memory of this catastrophe, a sophisticated, island-based maritime civilization that had been powerful, wealthy, and technologically advanced, located in the sea north of Crete, which was then swallowed by volcanic fire and seismic destruction, was the real historical event behind Plato's story of Atlantis. This hypothesis has since been developed by many scholars and has accumulated a substantial body of supporting evidence. The geographical match is imperfect, but not negligible. Thera lies in the Aegean, not in the Atlantic, and it is very much smaller than the landmass Plato describes. But if Plato's source was an Egyptian priestly tradition that had preserved a garbled memory of the Bronze Age disaster, distorted through multiple translations and thousands of years of oral transmission, then certain kinds of exaggeration and displacement would be expected. The dating discrepancy is one of the most discussed issues. Plato places Atlantis 9,000 years before Solon, while Thera erupted around 900 years before Solon. A factor of 10 error in the transmission of numbers across languages and centuries is not implausible, and some scholars have argued for exactly this explanation. The cultural parallels are also suggestive. Minoan Crete was an island civilization of remarkable sophistication. Its palace complexes, like the Atlantean capital Plato describes, were elaborate and centrally organized. Its navy was dominant in the Aegean. Its economy was redistributive, collecting resources from a wide hinterland and managing them from central palatial storehouses. The Minoan connection to the bull leaping scenes, the bull's horns used as architectural decoration, the legend of the Minotaur, which preserves in mythological form some memory of the actual bull cult practices of Bronze Age Crete, resonates with Plato's description of a bull sacrifice at the center of the Atlantean ritual life, where the 10 kings hunted sacred bulls without weapons and sacrificed them to Poseidon. None of this constitutes proof. The Minoan-Thera hypothesis for Atlantis is compelling, intellectually serious, and supported by genuine archaeological and geological evidence. But it requires accepting a number of assumptions about how the tradition was transmitted, how much it was altered in transmission, and how precisely Plato's numbers should be taken. Even among researchers who find the hypothesis plausible, significant disagreements remain about the details. But the Thera eruption was real. The Minoan collapse was real. The transformation of a large Aegean island into the crescent of ruins that exists today was real. And the idea that human beings living through or in the wake of an event of that magnitude would preserve some memory of it, however distorted, in the stories they told their children, and their children told their children. That idea is not just plausible. It is exactly how human memory works. While archaeologists in the Aegean were building the Minoan hypothesis through patient excavation and careful analysis, a very different kind of Atlantis research was taking shape on the other side of the world, in the warm, shallow waters off the coast of the Bahamas, where a discovery in 1968 would ignite one of the most persistent controversies in the history of underwater archaeology. The story begins, improbably, with a man named Edgar Cayce, who had died more than 20 years before the discovery that seemed to confirm one of his most extraordinary predictions. Cayce was an American psychic and spiritual healer who became famous in the early 20th century for his claimed ability to enter a trance state and deliver medical diagnoses, spiritual teachings and prophetic readings that his followers found uncannily accurate. He spoke at length about Atlantis, more probably than any other individual in the 20th century, describing it as a real civilization of great technological sophistication that had used powerful crystals as energy sources. that had possessed something like aircraft, that had developed a spiritual science of consciousness, that modern civilization had entirely lost. Casey located Atlantis primarily in the Caribbean, and in the 1940s, before his death in 1945, he predicted that evidence of Atlantis would rise near the island of Bimini in the Bahamas before the end of the 1960s. When, in 1968, a pilot named Robert Brush and a biologist named J. Manson Valentine discovered a remarkable formation of large flat stones on the shallow seafloor near the western coast of North Bimini. Stones arranged in what appeared to be a curved road or wall structure, stretching for about half a kilometer. The timing was exactly as Casey had predicted, and his followers were electrified. The Bimini Road, as it came to be called, is genuinely unusual in appearance. The stones are large, flat, and roughly rectangular, ranging from about 2 to 4 meters in their longest dimensions. They are arranged in a single curved line, remarkably consistent in their alignment, lying in about 5 to 6 meters of water. When you see underwater photographs of the structure, it does look, in a certain light, like an ancient paved road or wall, the kind of thing you might expect from a submerged civilization. Professional geologists and archaeologists investigated the Bimini Road extensively over the following years, and the majority concluded that it was a natural formation, a type of geological feature called a beach rock, formed when sand and shell material cemented together in layers and then fractured along joint lines into roughly rectangular blocks as the seafloor subsided or sea levels rose. Beach rock formations of this kind are not uncommon in the Caribbean, and the linear arrangement of the Bimini stones can be explained by the geometry of natural fracture patterns in limestone. But not everyone was satisfied with this explanation, and the controversy over Bimini has never entirely resolved. Some researchers have argued that certain features of the stones, apparent tool marks, what looked like building courses stacked on top of each other, and in some areas, more complex arrangements than a simple linear crack would produce, cannot be explained purely by natural processes. The debate has continued intermittently ever since, producing papers on both sides, and at least one major underwater archaeological survey in the 1990s that found no evidence of artificial construction. What the Bimini debate illustrates, beyond the specific question of these particular stones, is a broader challenge that runs through all Atlantis research: the difficulty of distinguishing, in ambiguous physical evidence, between natural geological processes and the ruins of ancient human activity, especially when those ruins, if they exist, would have been submerged for thousands of years and subjected to continuous geological and biological alteration. The ocean is not a museum. Things buried underwater for millennia do not stay in the condition in which they were buried. They are colonized by organisms, shifted by currents, covered with sediment, chemically altered by contact with salt water. Even clearly artificial structures, given enough time and the right conditions, can come to look disturbingly like natural formations. The Caribbean theories for Atlantis did not end with Bimini. Various researchers have proposed that Cuba, the Yucatan Peninsula, or the shallow shelves north of the Bahamas might conceal the ruins of Atlantis, based on a combination of sonar surveys, geological arguments about sea level change, and selective readings of Plato's text. In 2001, ocean engineers working on a survey for a Cuban pipeline reported anomalous sonar returns from deep water off the northwestern tip of Cuba that they described as resembling the outlines of large regular structures, roads, buildings, plazas. Subsequent investigation suggested that the anomalies were likely natural geological formations, but the story attracted significant attention and became one of many online and documentary television controversies that keep Atlantis permanently in circulation in popular culture. Among the more startling proposals for the location of Atlantis is one that seems, at first encounter, almost comically implausible: that the lost civilization lies buried under the ice of Antarctica, at the bottom of the world, in a place that has been covered by kilometers of glacial ice for the past 12,000 years or more. And yet this hypothesis, developed seriously by a handful of researchers in the 20th century, draws on a remarkable piece of documentary evidence that remains unexplained to this day. In 1929, in the library of Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, a German theologian named Gustav Deissmann was cataloguing a collection of old maps and charts when he came across a sheepskin parchment bearing a map of the world. The map was signed by a Turkish admiral named Piri Reis and dated 1513, just 21 years after Columbus's first voyage to the Americas. Piri Reis was a real and important historical figure, a naval commander who fought in the Mediterranean, wrote an influential navigational guide to the Aegean and Mediterranean coasts, and was eventually executed, aged around 80, for disobeying orders during a military campaign. He was known to be a careful and meticulous man who took his cartography seriously. The Piri Reis map was extraordinary for its time in its representation of the Americas. It showed a roughly accurate coastline of South America that was, in 1513, less than 20 years after Europeans had first seen that coastline, impressively detailed. But what attracted even more attention from later researchers was the map's depiction of a large landmass at the bottom of the map, in the region that would correspond roughly to Antarctica. The problem is that Antarctica was not officially discovered until 1820, and even if some early explorer had glimpsed the Antarctic coast through fog or at a distance and recorded it without knowing what it was, the Piri Reis map seems to show not the ice-covered coastline that Antarctica has today, but a coastline more consistent with what Antarctica would look like if the ice were removed. A coastline corresponding, in some interpretations, to the subglacial geography of the continent. Piri Reis himself wrote on the map that he had compiled it from older source maps of various dates and origins, including maps that he said dated from the time of Alexander the Great. The implication, which a number of researchers, most notably the American historian Charles Hapgood in his 1966 book, Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, have drawn from this, is that the subglacial coastline of Antarctica was known to some civilization that existed before the continent was covered in ice, and that maps of this coastline were somehow preserved through the ages and eventually found their way into the sources that Piri Reis consulted. Hapgood went further. He proposed, in an earlier book called Earth's Shifting Crust, 1958, a geological theory called crustal displacement, in which the entire rigid outer shell of the Earth periodically slides over the molten interior as a single unit, shifting the geographical positions of the poles and causing rapid, drastic climate change. Under this theory, Antarctica could have been located at a more temperate latitude as recently as 12,000 years ago, warm enough to support human habitation, warm enough for a civilization to develop, warm enough for its coastline to be mapped. And when the crust shifted, Antarctica moved to the pole, the ice began to accumulate, and the civilization, if it existed, was buried. Hapgood's crustal displacement theory is is not accepted by mainstream geology. The mechanism he proposed is not consistent with the physics of tectonic movement, and the geological record does not support a rapid shift of the kind he described. The mainstream explanation for Antarctica's ice is a gradual cooling process over millions of years, not a sudden geographic displacement in geologically recent time. And careful analysis of the Piri Reis map by professional cartographers has suggested that the supposed Antarctic coastline may be a distorted and concatenated representation of various actually known coastlines, South America, Tierra del Fuego, and speculative features based on Marco Polo's descriptions, rather than a record of genuine pre-discovery observation. But the Piri Reis map remains genuinely puzzling in certain respects. Mainstream scholarship has not produced a completely satisfactory account of all its features, and the idea that some ancient, now lost civilization possessed geographical knowledge that should have been impossible for it to have continues to attract both serious researchers and committed enthusiasts whose commitment significantly exceeds their rigor. What the Antarctica hypothesis represents in the broader history of Atlantis research is the maximum extension of the hypothesis, the point at which the need to locate Atlantis somewhere produces a candidate so remote and so demanding of auxiliary theories that the overall edifice becomes impossible to evaluate by normal standards of evidence. It is a useful endpoint to visit precisely because it shows how the question can expand to fill any available intellectual space. Before we continue following the various hypothetical candidates for Atlantis across the globe, it is worth pausing to acknowledge something important and often overlooked in the popular discourse around this subject. Sunken cities are real. Not hypothetical, not legendary, genuinely real, documented, excavated, and in many cases still being actively studied. The history of human settlement and the history of rising and falling sea levels have combined to submerge real towns and cities around the world, and some of these discoveries have fundamentally changed our understanding of ancient history. The most dramatic of these is the ancient Indian city of Dwarka, located off the coast of Gujarat in northwestern India, in the Gulf of Kambat. Dwarka holds a special place in Hindu tradition as one of the holiest cities in India. It was the kingdom of the god Krishna, and its submersion beneath the sea is mentioned in the ancient Sanskrit texts as having occurred after Krishna's death, when the sea rose and reclaimed the land. For centuries, this was understood as mythology, as the kind of narrative embellishment that surrounds all sacred sites. Then, in the 1980s, archaeologists from the Marine Archaeology Centre of India began diving in the waters off the modern coastal city of Dwarka and found something astonishing. On the seafloor, in waters ranging from a few meters to about 10 meters deep, they found the remnants of a city. Stone walls and platforms, large stone anchors, artifacts including pottery and carved stone, all dating to between 3,000 and 5,000 years before the present. Some of the structures appeared to be precisely oriented to the cardinal directions in the manner of deliberately planned civic construction. The area covered by the submerged remains extends for several kilometers. In 2002, a survey in the Gulf of Kambat found even more extensive structural remains at depths of around 30 to 40 meters, though the interpretation of these deeper finds remains disputed. The submersion of ancient Dwarka is explicable without any catastrophic event. Sea levels around the world were lower during and immediately after the last ice age, and as the glaciers melted over thousands of years after approximately 12,000 years ago, sea levels rose by roughly 120 meters globally. This process was not uniform or smooth. It happened in pulses, with periods of rapid rise punctuated by pauses, and the local geography of coastlines, river deltas, and tectonic settings created enormous variability in how different regions experienced the change. The ancient city of Dwarka was built on a coast that the rising post-glacial sea eventually reclaimed. The memory of this submersion, preserved in oral tradition and eventually written down in the ancient texts, is a genuine historical memory of a real event, exactly the kind of process that might explain how Atlantis, if it was a real place, could survive in human memory for thousands of years. Off the southern tip of Japan, near the island of Yonaguni, a diving instructor named Kihachiro Aratake discovered in 1986 a series of submerged stone formations that sparked one of the most persistent debates in underwater archaeology. The Yonaguni Monument, as it came to be called, consists of massive flat-top terraces of rock with steep vertical faces, sharp corners, what appears to be a broad staircase of regular steps, and in some areas, carved grooves and channels. The structure drops from about 5 meters depth to about 27 meters. It was eventually connected, in the minds of its enthusiasts, to legends of an ancient Ryukyuan civilization called Nirai Kanai, a paradise land beneath the sea. The mainstream archaeological and geological opinion on Yonaguni is that it is a natural formation, a coastal rock terrace of fine-grained sandstone that fractures naturally into rectangular blocks along joint planes and bedding layers, creating the regular, staircase-like appearance without any human intervention. But a minority of researchers, including some with formal geological and archaeological credentials, argue that certain features, the precision of the corners, the regularity of some carved-seeming channels, the apparently consistent orientation of the structure, are more consistent with human modification than pure natural fracturing. And then there is Port Royal, Jamaica, a city that really did sink beneath the sea in living historical memory. On June 7th, 1692, a massive earthquake struck the island of Jamaica and caused a significant portion of the city of Port Royal to liquefy and slide into the harbour. Port Royal at that time was one of the most prosperous and notorious cities in the Caribbean, known as the wickedest city on earth, for its concentration of pirates, privateers, rum merchants, and slaves. Within 2 minutes, roughly 33 acres of the city were beneath the water. 2,000 people died in the initial disaster. The surviving portion of the city was then devastated by a tsunami. The event was so sudden and so complete that the submerged portion of Port Royal preserved an archaeological record of 17th century Caribbean life in extraordinary detail, with furniture still in place, food still in storage, and personal belongings scattered exactly where they had been when the earth moved. Port Royal is significant for the Atlantis discussion because it demonstrates that the submersion of a city, of an entire urban civilization, can happen suddenly, catastrophically, and within living memory. People who saw Port Royal standing in the morning could see it beneath the sea in the afternoon. Their children would grow up hearing about it. Their grandchildren would pass on the memory. And over generations, over centuries, that memory would change, would acquire mythological accretions, moral interpretations, exaggerations, until, given long enough, it might become something like a legend. There is a place beneath the North Sea, between the coasts of what is now Britain and the Netherlands and Denmark. Why, if you could somehow drain the sea and stand on the exposed seafloor, you would find yourself in a broad, gently rolling plain, crossed by rivers and estuaries, dotted with lakes and marshes, rich in game and fish and wild plants. A landscape that, 12,000 years ago, was home to a significant human population. This lost landscape is called Doggerland, and its story is perhaps the most profound piece of geological context for the Atlantis question that we possess. During the last ice age, which reached its maximum extent around 26,000 years ago, so much of the Earth's water was locked up in continental ice sheets that sea levels were roughly 120 meters lower than today. This meant that the shallow continental shelves around the world's coastlines were exposed as dry land. The North Sea was almost entirely dry, a vast landscape connecting Britain to continental Europe across what is now open water. The British Isles were not islands at all, but a peninsula of northwestern Europe. The Rhine, the Thames, and the other rivers of the region flowed together in a combined drainage system across the exposed floor and emptied into the Atlantic far to the north. As the Ice Age ended and temperatures rose, the glaciers melted and the sea began to rise, at first slowly, then in accelerating pulses, as large ice dams broke and lake-sized bodies of glacial meltwater poured into the ocean in geological instants. The North Sea filled. Doggerland shrank. The population living there, and there was certainly a population there, as evidenced by the stone tools, carved bones and occasional human remains that trawling fishermen and archaeological surveys have recovered from the North Sea floor, was forced to move, driven higher and higher by water that was rising not at the barely perceptible rate of modern sea level rise, but at rates that could, in the worst episodes, be measured in meters per century or even per decade. Around 8,000 years ago, the Storegga Slide, a massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway, one of the largest submarine landslides in geological history, generated a tsunami that swept across the remaining low-lying areas of Doggerland, possibly delivering a final devastating blow to any communities still clinging to the shrinking landscape. Not long after, Doggerland was gone. And what had been a rich and populated plain was the North Sea. The people who experienced the flooding of Doggerland were fully modern humans, cognitively indistinguishable from us, living in communities with language and memory, and the capacity to preserve their history and narrative. Their descendants, who eventually became the populations of coastal Britain, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Germany, would have carried memories of this catastrophe. Those memories would have been expressed in story, in ritual, in the way they understood their relationship to the sea that had taken their homeland. Over generations, over millennia, those memories would have changed in the way that all oral traditions change, accumulating symbolism, moral interpretation, and mythological elaboration. The flooding of Doggerland was not a single event on a single day. It was a process stretching over thousands of years, punctuated by acute episodes of rapid inundation. The people who lived through its final stages experienced something that would have been genuinely traumatic and incomprehensible by any ordinary frame of reference. A homeland dissolving under their feet, a world that was ending not metaphorically, but literally. The story of a great, fertile land that sank beneath the sea and was lost forever is exactly the kind of story that this experience would produce. Researchers studying the archaeology of Doggerland, using sub-bottom profiler surveys, sediment cores, and the analysis of artifacts recovered from the seafloor have been gradually building a picture of the landscape and its inhabitants over the past 2 decades. What they are finding is a place that was genuinely rich, a hunter-gatherer's paradise, full of game and freshwater fish and seasonal plant resources, probably supporting a significant population that was more densely settled than many comparable landscapes of the same period. The loss of this landscape, as sea levels rose, represented one of the largest displacement events in prehistoric Europe. Could Doggerland be Atlantis? The question, posed directly, immediately runs into the same problems that face every candidate. The geography is wrong. Doggerland was in the North Sea, not the Atlantic. The chronology is off by thousands of years from even the most generous reinterpretation of Plato's numbers. There were no cities in Doggerland in the conventional sense, no palace architecture, no complex stratified society of the kind Plato describes. And yet, as a background explanation for where the deep human memory of a great drowned land might originate, Doggerland is as good a candidate as any, because here we have not a hypothesis but a fact, a large, populated, productive landscape that was swallowed by the sea within the time frame of human memory, and whose loss would have been felt by the people who experienced it as an overwhelming catastrophe. The world has known many Doggerlands. It has known them on every continent that borders a shallow sea. As the ice ages ended and the seas rose, coastlines retreated by tens to hundreds of kilometers. Entire river valleys were drowned. Entire island chains were submerged. The people who lived in these places carried the memory of them in their bodies and their stories. And some of those stories, filtered through thousands of years of telling and retelling, translated between languages, overlaid with mythological and moral interpretation, may be what we are, reading when we read Plato. By the second half of the 20th century, the search for Atlantis had acquired tools that earlier seekers could not have imagined. Sonar systems capable of mapping the seafloor in 3 dimensions, satellite imaging that could detect subtle variations in ocean surface height, corresponding to geological features beneath the water, remotely operated underwater vehicles equipped with high-resolution cameras and sampling arms, side-scan sonar that could produce photographic quality images of the seafloor at depths of thousands of meters. And gradually, reluctantly, the geological and archaeological establishments began applying some of these tools to the problem, not necessarily out of any belief that Atlantis existed, but because the same technologies that might incidentally answer the Atlantis question were also revolutionizing legitimate oceanographic and archaeological research. In the early 2000s, a team of Spanish researchers led by Georgios Diaz Montexano, and separately, a group of geologists from the University of Huelva, turned their attention to the area off the southwestern coast of Spain, near the mouth of the Guadalquivir River and the ancient marshlands of the Doñana National Park. This region, they argued, was a geographically plausible location for Atlantis. It lay just inside the Pillars of Hercules, rather than outside them. It was a coastline with a long history of catastrophic flooding and seismic activity. And the geological structure of the region included large areas of former coast that had been inundated by the sea in historical and prehistorical times. Their surveys found intriguing anomalies in the sediment beneath the Doñana marshes, buried structures that, interpreted in one way, could resemble the remains of a concentric ring settlement pattern, roughly consistent with Plato's description. A BBC documentary in 2011, based partly on their work, attracted enormous attention. A researcher named Richard Freund from the University of Hartford participated in the survey and argued, somewhat more emphatically than his Spanish colleagues, that the buried anomalies represented real evidence of an Atlantis-like civilization. The more cautious interpretation of his Spanish collaborators was that the anomalies might represent a Bronze Age settlement of some kind, possibly Tartessos, a mysterious ancient civilization of southwestern Iberia that flourished between about 800 and 500 BCE, and that has its own long history of association with Atlantis theories, but that the connection to Plato's Atlantis was speculative. Tartessos is itself a fascinating and genuinely mysterious ancient civilization that deserves more attention than it typically receives, mentioned by Herodotus and other ancient writers as a fabulously wealthy trading city at the western end of the Mediterranean. Tartessos was famous in antiquity for its silver and for the antiquity of its records. Herodotus says its king, Arganthonios, who supposedly lived to be 150 years old, claimed that Tartessian records went back 700 years before his time. Despite this fame in antiquity, Tartessos has never been definitively located, and no archaeological site has been identified with certainty as the city described in ancient sources. It is, in a sense, the other great mystery of the ancient Western Mediterranean, and the possibility that Plato's Atlantis was a garbled or idealized version of Tartessos, a real city of extraordinary wealth on the Atlantic coast, eventually destroyed by floods, has attracted serious scholarly attention. Meanwhile, in the Eastern Mediterranean, a researcher named Robert Sarmast mounted a series of submarine expeditions off the coast of Cyprus in 2004 and 2006, claiming that sonar surveys had revealed a sunken plateau approximately 80 kilometers south of the island that showed what he interpreted as man-made structures. Walls, roads, a central hill resembling the Acropolis Plato describes, at a depth of about 1,500 meters. Sarmast was a passionate advocate for his hypothesis, arguing that Cyprus and the Eastern Mediterranean fit Plato's account better than most other candidates when the Greek text was read carefully, and certain translated terms were understood in their proper ancient meanings. The Cyprus hypothesis attracted considerable interest and media coverage, but the geological interpretation of his sonar data was contested by marine geologists, who argued that the features he identified were natural products of the tectonic and volcanic history of the Eastern Mediterranean floor. Sarmast's expeditions did not produce the corroborating physical evidence. Artifacts, architectural remnants, datable material that would have been necessary to move the discussion from interesting hypothesis to compelling argument. What all of these modern searches have in common, whether they are conducted by professional geologists or enthusiastic amateurs, is the experience of encountering an ocean floor that is both extraordinarily complex and extraordinarily difficult to read without extensive expertise. The seafloor is not a blank slate onto which ancient cities can easily be projected. It is a dynamic geological environment that has been continuously reshaped by tectonic movement, volcanic activity, sediment deposition, erosion, biological colonization, and the effects of changing sea levels. Distinguishing a human artifact from a natural feature in this environment is genuinely hard. Harder than it looks on a sonar screen, harder than it looks in the glossy images of documentary films, and often requiring years of patient analysis by specialists in multiple disciplines. The honest summary of what modern technology has found, as of the present, is this: nothing that unambiguously settles the question. There are intriguing anomalies, contested interpretations, and areas of genuine geological uncertainty. There is no smoking gun. There is no Rosetta Stone of Atlantis waiting to be found on a seafloor somewhere, its inscriptions still legible, its location corresponding exactly to Plato's description. Or if there is, we have not found it yet. We have spent a great deal of time following the physical search for Atlantis, the geological expeditions, the archaeological hypotheses, the sonar surveys. But there is another tradition of Atlantis inquiry, running parallel to the physical search, that engages with the question at a fundamentally different level. Not where was Atlantis, but what did Plato mean by it? And this tradition, which belongs to philosophy and literary analysis, rather than geology and archaeology, has produced some of the most sophisticated thinking about the problem. To engage seriously with this tradition, we need to return to the question of Plato's purpose as a writer. We need to understand what kind of man he was, and what he was trying to accomplish in the late works in which the Atlantis story appears. Plato was, at his deepest level, a political philosopher. His fundamental concern, running through all his major works, was the question of justice, of how human beings should live together, what constitutes good governance, and what the relationship is between the ideal and the actual in political life. The Republic, his most famous work, proposed a utopian city governed by philosopher kings who had been trained in mathematics and philosophy to perceive the eternal forms behind the changing world of appearances. But the Republic was not naive. Plato knew perfectly well that ideal cities were not the same as real cities, and much of his later work grapples with the practical problem of how the insights of philosophy can be brought to bear on the messy reality of actual political life. The Atlantis story, in this light, looks very much like a philosophical instrument designed to do specific analytical work. The Atlanteans are corrupted by wealth and power. They represent the dangers of a certain kind of political success, a society that achieves material prosperity and military dominance, but loses its moral compass in the process. Athens, in the story, represents the philosophical ideal, a small, virtuous, disciplined city that draws on its inner resources rather than its external wealth to face a much more powerful enemy, and prevails. The contrast is between two different visions of what civilization is for, one based on the accumulation of wealth and power, one based on justice and virtue. This is not merely a reading imposed from outside the text. Plato makes the moral dimensions of the story explicit. In the Critias, he describes at length how the Atlanteans' divine nature was diluted by the dominance of their human element, how they became greedy and domineering, how their appearance of goodness was maintained only as a mask over an inner corruption that the gods could see clearly. The structural parallel with Athens after the Peloponnesian War, a city that had accumulated an empire, grown wealthy and powerful, and then been humbled by overreach and internal corruption, is not subtle, but acknowledging that the story has a clear philosophical and moral function does not settle the question of whether it also contains historical content. Literature and history are not mutually exclusive categories. A writer can simultaneously be recording a genuine tradition and shaping it to serve a moral or philosophical purpose. The two activities are not incompatible. In fact, the most powerful historical writing almost always selects and emphasizes and frames its material to serve an interpretive purpose, while still resting on a foundation of real events. The philosopher Karl Popper, one of the most important philosophers of science of the 20th century, was deeply interested in Plato and particularly critical of him. Popper's reading of the Republic was that it was a blueprint for totalitarianism, a closed society governed by a hereditary philosophical elite, hostile to change and diversity. Plato's ideal state, Popper argued in The Open Society and Its Enemies, was explicitly modelled on Sparta and represented the political preference of a man who distrusted democracy because it had killed his beloved teacher. If Popper's reading of Plato is correct, then the Atlantis story takes on a specific political coloration. The ancient Athens of the story, the virtuous, austere, philosophically governed city that repelled the Atlantean Empire, looks very much like the idealized Sparta that Plato admired, while the Atlanteans, with their vast navy and their commercial wealth and their democratic imperial ambitions, look very much like the Athens that Plato actually lived in and distrusted. The story, in this reading, is not just a moral fable about hubris and justice in the abstract. It is a pointed political allegory about the specific political choices facing Athens in Plato's lifetime. Neither the purely allegorical reading nor the purely historical reading fully satisfies. The allegorical reading has to explain away an almost embarrassing quantity of specific, concrete detail that serves no obvious allegorical purpose. The purely historical reading has to explain how a tradition of such specific detail could have survived for 9,000 years, or even 900 years, through purely oral transmission, without acquiring the distortions and losses that oral traditions characteristically suffer over time. What seems most likely to scholars who have spent careers thinking about this question is something in between, that Plato was working with a genuine tradition, probably a relatively old account, possibly derived ultimately from Egyptian priestly records of some Bronze Age catastrophe in the Mediterranean or the Atlantic world, and that he was shaping this tradition with the conscious and unconscious purposes of a philosopher who had strong views about the nature of civilization and the dangers of imperial overreach. The tradition and the moral framework are not separable, because Plato himself probably could not have separated them. He was the kind of writer who thought through narrative, who worked out his ideas in the process of telling stories. The story of Atlantis in Western culture is not only a story of scholars and explorers and philosophers, it is also a story of how a single classical text, amplified by Donnelly's 19th century synthesis, and then by the mass media of the 20th century, became one of the most productive and shape-shifting myths in human history. A story capacious enough to accommodate almost any ideological or spiritual agenda, and adaptable enough to survive intact through centuries of radical change in what educated people believed about the world. Jules Verne was one of the first major modern writers to engage with Atlantis in fiction, and his treatment in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, published in 1870, set a tone that much subsequent fiction would follow. Captain Nemo, the novel's enigmatic protagonist, guides his submarine Nautilus across the submerged ruins of Atlantis in one of the book's most memorable chapters, a moonlit underwater landscape of ruined columns and half-buried palaces, glimpsed through the submarine's windows as the characters walk in diving suits across the ancient seafloor. Verne's Atlantis is serene, ghostly, and melancholy, a world perfected in its destruction, preserved by the sea that killed it. He presents it without argument, without controversy, simply as a fact that the ocean floor has quietly kept while the surface world forgot. This image, the submerged city, the drowned grandeur, the ruins waiting in blue-green silence to be rediscovered, became one of the most enduring visual metaphors of the modern imagination. It appeared in paintings, in early cinema, in the illustrations of popular magazines, and eventually in the iconography of the 20th century's science fiction and fantasy traditions. The image of Atlantis that most people carry in their heads is essentially Verne's image, refined and elaborated through a century of artistic interpretation. But Atlantis also attracted interests that were darker and more ideologically freighted. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the theosophical movement founded by Helena Petrovna Blavatsky developed an elaborate mythology of Atlantis as one of a series of great root races that had successively inhabited the earth in the distant past. Blavatsky, who claimed to receive her revelations through psychic contact with hidden spiritual masters, described Atlantis as the fourth root race, a civilization of physical giants possessed of psychic powers and an advanced spiritual science that had been destroyed by the misuse of those powers. This version of Atlantis, which owed more to Blavatsky's inventiveness than to Plato's text, became enormously influential in the esoteric and occult traditions of the 20th century, and fed directly into the various New Age spiritualities that claimed Atlantean heritage. More disturbingly, elements of Atlantis mythology were absorbed into Nazi racial ideology in the 1920s and 1930s. A series of German occultists and racial theorists, drawing on theosophical sources and on the work of writers like the Austrian mystic Guido von List and the founder of the Ariosophist movement, proposed that Atlantis had been the original homeland of the Aryan race, that the superior civilization Plato described was the cradle of what they imagined as the Germanic or Nordic racial lineage. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, was particularly fascinated by these ideas and sponsored expeditions to locations including Tibet in search of evidence for Aryan origins. The Atlantis of Nazi imagination was a very different beast from Plato's ambiguous empire. It was a paradise of racial purity, a golden age destroyed not by divine punishment for hubris, but by racial mixing and moral degeneration, a loss that the Third Reich's racial project was supposedly reversing. This appropriation of Atlantis mythology by the Nazi movement is a reminder that ancient myths do not exist in a vacuum. They are always available to be recruited by ideological projects, and the more powerful and resonant the myth, the more uses and misuses it tends to accumulate. The Atlantis myth, with its themes of a lost golden age, a civilization superior to anything in the present, a destruction linked to moral failure, and a possible future recovery, was essentially tailor-made for co-option by any political movement that wanted to claim access to a lost perfection. The 20th century's film and television industry has given Atlantis a vivid and largely benign popular afterlife, from the early silent films of the 1920s through the Disney animated feature of 2001 to the dozens of documentary series on streaming platforms today. Atlantis has proven to be essentially inexhaustible as popular entertainment. In cinema, it has been a lost paradise, a technological utopia, a source of supernatural power, a cautionary tale, and a setting for adventure stories of every description. In documentary television, it has provided the occasion for endless episodes of archaeological speculation, underwater cinematography, and the particular kind of excitement that comes from suggesting, however implausibly, that a mystery might finally be on the verge of resolution. The persistence of Atlantis in popular culture is not accidental and not simply a product of marketing. It speaks to something deep and apparently permanent in the human appetite for a specific kind of story. The story of a great civilization that was lost, that lies hidden somewhere accessible if you know where to look, that might someday be recovered. This appetite is connected to the universal human experience of personal loss, to the hope that what has been lost can be recovered, and to the intuition that the world contains hidden depths that the ordinary surface of daily experience conceals. Atlantis gives these feelings a local habitation and a name. Let us pause here, in the final stretch of this long journey, and ask a question that is surprisingly rarely addressed directly in Atlantis discourse. If Atlantis were found, if someone tomorrow discovered undeniable physical evidence of a sophisticated civilization that had existed in the Atlantic Ocean, or the Mediterranean, or anywhere else, before the beginning of the accepted historical record, what would it actually mean? The question matters because it forces us to clarify what exactly we are looking for and why. The answer is not obvious, and thinking it through carefully reveals how much of the Atlantis obsession is really about things that have very little to do with Plato's text. For professional archaeologists and historians, the discovery of a genuine Atlantis, meaning a sophisticated, complex, literate civilization predating the Mesopotamian and Egyptian civilizations by thousands of years, would be a revolution of the first order. It would require a fundamental rethinking of the standard narrative of human civilizational development, which holds that complex urban societies with writing, monumental architecture, and stratified social organization began to emerge independently in Mesopotamia and Egypt around 5,000 years ago, followed by the Indus Valley, China, and Mesoamerica. The discovery of a sophisticated civilization predating these by even 1,000 years, let alone the 9,000 years Plato claims, would demand a complete revision of our understanding of what conditions are necessary for complex society to develop and how long the process takes. But this raises an immediate and important question. What counts as evidence? This is not a trivial methodological point. The history of archaeology is full of examples of features that seemed, on initial inspection, to be artificial, to be the products of human construction, and turned out on careful analysis to be natural formations. It is also full of examples of the opposite, features that seemed natural but turned out to be human-made. The capacity of the human mind to see patterns in ambiguous data, to perceive order, structure, and intentionality in things that may be random or natural, is simultaneously our greatest cognitive asset and our greatest source of systematic error. For a discovery of Atlantis to be scientifically compelling, it would need to produce multiple independent lines of evidence converging on the same conclusion. We would need physical artifacts that could be definitively identified as artificial, tools, pottery, worked stone that could be dated by radiocarbon or other methods to the relevant period. We would need architectural remains that showed clear evidence of intentional construction, not just regular geological formation. We would need, ideally, evidence of writing or some other system of symbolic communication, since a civilization of the sophistication Plato describes would almost certainly have been literate. And all of this evidence would need to come from a context that could be explained only by the presence of an advanced civilization. not by any combination of natural geological processes and more recent human activity. The probability of finding all of this, of finding beneath the sea somewhere, an undisturbed site containing all these elements in a condition that could withstand rigorous scientific scrutiny, is not zero, but it is very small. The ocean is not hospitable to the preservation of ancient materials. Salt water corrodes metal, wood rots, unfired clay dissolves. Organic materials are consumed by biological processes. Only certain materials, fired ceramics, worked stone, some metals, survive thousands of years of submersion in any recognizable form, and their survival depends on specific local conditions of sediment burial, water chemistry, and biological activity that are not common. There is also the troubling question of what we should expect not to find. If a civilization of the size and sophistication Plato describes had existed, it would have had a presence, not just in one physical location, but across a wide network of trading partners, colonies, and cultural contacts. Its pottery, its metalwork, its architectural conventions, its writing system would have left traces in the archaeological record of adjacent regions, just as Minoan Crete left traces in Egypt and Mycenaean Greece and Syria. The absence of such traces in the archaeological records of the Mediterranean and Atlantic world, the fact that no characteristic Atlantean pottery style, no recognizably Atlantean architectural tradition, no undeciphered script from the right period and place, has turned up in the thousands of sites excavated over the past 2 centuries, is a fact that must be weighed seriously. This is the epistemological problem that philosophers of science call the problem of absence. The absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence, as the saying goes, but it is not nothing either. The absence of evidence becomes progressively more telling as the search becomes more thorough, as the methods become more sensitive, and as the number of independent investigations that have found nothing accumulates. After 200 years of systematic archaeological investigation of the Mediterranean world, the absence of any clearly Atlantean material culture from any known site is a significant datum, even if it is not a definitive one. The most philosophically honest position, in the end, is probably this: Atlantis, if it existed as Plato describes it, would be the most significant archaeological discovery in human history. The search for it is not unreasonable. It is, in fact, exactly the kind of investigation that distinguishes curious, history-loving human beings from creatures who are content to accept the world as they find it. But the evidence accumulated over more than 2 millennia of searching does not support the conclusion that Atlantis existed as a specific, locatable physical place that is simply waiting to be found. What the evidence does support is a richer and, in some ways, more interesting conclusion: that the story of Atlantis is a complex layering of genuine historical memory, philosophical invention, cultural transmission, and human longing, and that each of these layers has its own truth. We have traveled a long way together, following the trail of Atlantis from Plato's writing room in 4th century Athens to the bottom of the North Sea, from the caldera of Thera to the shallow waters off Bimini, from the excavations at Knossos to the sonar surveys off the coast of Spain. We have met philosophers and archaeologists and geologists and mystics and novelists and Nazi occultists, each of whom saw in the Atlantis story a mirror for whatever they most needed to see. We have followed the long, winding, often frustrating, always fascinating story of a civilization that may or may not have existed, searched for by people, who are often more interesting than anything they found. What are we left with at the end of this journey? We are left, first, with the ocean, the actual physical ocean, which is not a metaphor, but a fact. The ocean covers 71% of the surface of the Earth. Its average depth is about 3,700 meters, and its deepest point is nearly 11,000 meters below the surface. Only a small fraction of the seafloor has been mapped to a resolution comparable to the maps we have of the land surface. Less than 20% of the ocean floor has been mapped with high-resolution sonar. More of the human past is almost certainly hidden beneath the ocean than is preserved in all the museums and archives and excavated sites in the world combined. The ocean is the world's largest and most comprehensive archive, and we have barely begun to read it. We are left, second, with the remarkable fact of human memory, the extraordinary capacity of human beings to preserve knowledge across generations, through oral tradition, through story, through ritual and art and architecture, across time spans that seem impossibly long, but that the evidence of archaeology and linguistics shows us are genuine. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia preserve oral traditions that have been confirmed by geological evidence to accurately describe coastal landscapes that were submerged more than 10,000 years ago. The Hawaiian oral traditions contain accurate descriptions of navigational routes between islands separated by thousands of miles of open ocean. The flood myths that appear independently in cultures around the world are not simply metaphorical. They are, at some level, memories of real events, however distorted and elaborated they have become in the telling. The world that human beings inhabited at the end of the last ice age, 12,000 years ago, when the great glaciers were beginning their retreat and the seas were beginning their long rise, was a world full of civilization in the sense of complex, intelligent, adaptive human society, though not civilization in the sense of cities and writing and monumental architecture. The people who lived in Doggerland, who fished the rivers of the submerged continental shelves, who built their communities on the coasts that the rising sea would eventually claim. These people were fully human. They had language, religion, social structure, technology, art, and memory. And when the water came for their homes, they remembered. Some of what they remembered may have reached Plato, not directly, not cleanly, not in the form of a verified historical document, but in the form of an old story, passed through many hands, shaped and reshaped by each retelling, until a philosopher in Athens recognized in it the outline of a moral and historical argument that matched his deepest convictions about the nature of civilization and its fragility. We are left, third, with the persistence of the search itself, with the 2,000-year record of human beings who simply could not let this question go. This persistence is sometimes dismissed as credulity or wishful thinking, and sometimes it is exactly that. But it is also something else, a recognition, possibly intuitive and certainly not always well articulated, that the world is older and stranger and more layered than the official historical narrative acknowledges. The mainstream account of human civilization, cities beginning in Mesopotamia around 3,200 BCE, writing independently, invented in a handful of places. The spread of civilization following traceable routes across the ancient world is well supported and carefully evidenced. But it is also, unavoidably, a partial account, built from the fragmentary survival of evidence. and constrained by the reach of archaeological investigation. The people who search for Atlantis are often responding to a genuine and legitimate intuition that there is more to the past than we have yet recovered. They are often wrong in the specific conclusions they draw, frequently credulous about weak evidence, and sometimes, frankly, exploitative of popular ignorance. But the underlying intuition that the history of human civilization is longer and more complex and more interrupted by catastrophe than the textbook version suggests is not wrong. It is, in fact, entirely consistent with what geology and climate science and archaeology have been demonstrating with increasing specificity over the past several decades. The ocean does remember, not in the way a human mind remembers, not with narratives and meanings and the emotional weight of loss, but in the way that a geological record remembers, in the density of sediment layers, in the chemistry of isotopes preserved in ancient shells, in the pollen trapped in deep sea cores, in the changing shapes of coastlines that carry the signatures of long-past transgression and regression. These are memories written in rock and salt and the slow accumulation of time, and they are telling us, with increasing clarity, that the world has undergone changes in the human past far more dramatic than the stable Holocene of the past few thousand years suggests. Atlantis, whatever it was, a specific historical civilization, a composite of several lost cultures, a philosophical invention built on a foundation of genuine ancient memory, a myth that encodes the universal human experience of loss and the passing of great things, has served for 2,300 years as a focal point for something essential in the human character: the refusal to accept that what is lost forever, the conviction that the past can be recovered if you look hard enough and think carefully enough, the belief that the ocean, for all its indifference and depth and power, has not been able to erase everything. There is a quietness in the deep ocean that is unlike any silence on land. It is not the absence of sound so much as the presence of a different kind of time. Geological time, evolutionary time, the time in which continents drift and mountains rise and seas advance and retreat. In that silence, cities sleep. Forests that no living human has seen grow silently in sediment that no current disturbs. Rivers that once nourished civilizations flow still, a few meters below the seafloor, their courses preserved in the stratigraphy of accumulated layers. Whether Atlantis lies among them, whether somewhere in that vast, dim, pressured quiet, there is a place where the ruins of Plato's concentric rings wait in the silt, where the metal of orichalcum has corroded to indecipherability, where the channels that once carried warships to the sea have filled with the slow, patient fall of marine snow. We cannot say. We have not found it. We may never find it. We may find something we did not expect, some other lost thing that reframes the question entirely, that makes us realize the question was always slightly wrong. Or we may find nothing, and conclude at last that Plato's genius lay not in preserving an ancient record, but in inventing one so vivid and so morally resonant that 2,000 years of readers could not let it go. Either conclusion is, in its own way, astonishing. The great explorer Herodotus, himself a traveler through Egypt, a collector of traditions, a man who believed that the past was alive and that it mattered, said that he wrote history so that human achievements would not be forgotten by time. Plato, we might say, did something different. He wrote about a civilization so thoroughly forgotten that not even its ruins remained, as a reminder that time does forget, that the ocean does take, that the greatest achievements of human civilization are always, on a long enough timescale, provisional. The search for Atlantis will continue. It always has. New technologies will be applied to old questions. New interpretations of Plato's text will circulate and be debated. New geological surveys will find new anomalies on the seafloor that will be argued about for years. New candidates will emerge, be investigated, and be set aside or accepted provisionally. And through all of this, the story will persist. Not because it is proved, not because it is disproved, but because it asks a question that human beings cannot stop asking. What have we lost that we don't remember losing? And is it still there, waiting, beneath the water, in the dark? The sea is very old, and it does not give up its secrets easily. But we have always been the kind of creature that asks it to try.